Hello and welcome to Kirchburn Publishing. Today I am going to take a look at the history of a Greenock institution, or should I say two Greenock institutions, each with the same name, each connected to the other in some way, and in two entirely different locations. The Tontine. From an 1804 advert, to be let. The elegant and commodious inn, now nearly finished, known by the name of the Tontine, together with the extensive stables and coach-houses attached thereto. Travellers have long complained of the want of proper accommodation in Greenock. The Tontine Inn will in future prevent the possibility of any complaints of this nature, and the possession of it must be an object highly deserving the attention of any experienced person in this line of business, who, in an increasing town like Greenock, cannot fail to meet the greatest encouragement and success. Applications to be made in writing to the Treasurer, who will lay them before the committee, and a day will be appointed to take the same into consideration and determine thereon. By order of the committee, James Leach, Treasurer. The Tontine Inn contains the following accommodations: handsome public rooms, 8 excellent parlours, 22 bedrooms with dressing closets, bar room and commodious family apartments, commodious kitchen, servants' apartments, cellars, catacombs, etc. The stables contain stalls for horses, and besides coach houses, hayloft and granaries, there are several comfortable dwelling houses for the families of the different servants employed about the house. The subscribers, 400 in number, were procured in the course of 2 days, making the subscription, which was £25 per share, amount to £10,000. In consequence of non-payment, 23 were struck off the list, which reduced the members to 377. But what exactly is a tontine? The official description is an annuity shared by subscribers to a loan or common fund, the shares increasing as subscribers die until the last survivor enjoys the whole income. In other words, it's a bet on who is going to benefit financially by living the longest. This was the setup for the Greenock Tontine. It attracted investors in the town and elsewhere, who saw this business opportunity as a good one, considering the growth of the town and the hope that providing hotel rooms and meeting rooms would be a profitable business. A group had previously tried to set up a theatre in Greenock on the same Tontine basis. As you can see, in the same month of 1802, subscriptions were advertised and gathered for the erection of a Tontine theatre, but it was never built and the subscriptions were returned to members. A Stephen Kemble went on to build a theatre on Mansion House Lane, opposite the new Tontine Hotel. As well as hotel rooms, the Tontine was the major host of sales and meetings in town. It was a business centre, and so we can see from these adverts here. The first manager of the Tontine appears to have been a John Park, an original member of the Greenock Burns Club and grandfather of the Greenock librarian Alan Park Peyton, pictured here. In the 1820s, the actor Edmund Kean visited the town and stayed at the Tontine. He had somewhat of a reputation. The newspaper report goes, "A friend who is well up in theatrical history, Mr. M. MacDonnell, sends me an interesting account of Edmund Kean's visit to Greenock, the story of which appeared on the Telegraph recently. He views the incident from a different angle. He writes, "When I wrote my reminiscences of Edmund Kean in 1911, I was indebted to Mr. J. Fraser Peyton, whose grandfather managed or owned the Tontine Hotel in 1826. Where the famous actor stayed on his visits to and from his cottage at the Loch Rothsay for the following story. Edmund Kean was engaged for a week at the Old Theatre Royal, Mansion House Lane, in 1826, but on the Saturday night, while playing Richard III, he refused to allow Richmond to kill him in the last act. He was hissed and left the theatre in a temper. He crossed over to the Tontine in Cathcart Street in his Richard dress, and Mr. Peyton's grandmother, who said he was a fine type of man, locked him in his room, not because he had too much drink, but he was hilarious and wanted to kiss all the ladies in the hotel. He got out by jumping over the window and walked down to the foot of Cross-Shore Street, where his lug sailboat was waiting to take him to Rothesay. The boatmen were delighted as he recited to them most of the way down. This had nothing to do with the hostile reception he received at Glasgow in 1822, owing to domestic troubles. Here is an advert from the 5th of August 1844. For the Greenock Tontine, a general meeting of the proprietors of the Greenock Tontine will be held within the inn on Thursday, the 15th day of August current, at 1 o'clock afternoon, for the purpose of electing a new committee of management for the period of 3 years from and after that date. A full meeting of the proprietors is requested. There was Mr. MacDonald, the proprietor, who always appeared like a clergyman in a white stock. His visitors' list, as it appeared in the Greenock Advertiser, read like a page of the court journal, as it was a stopping place of the Highland lairds and the English aristocrats on their way to the Highlands. This advert shows the sale of a Greenock-built ship, the Isabella Cooper, to be sold in the Tontine Inn on Wednesday, the 31st day of January. Here are a couple of the notices which give details of those who had visited the Tontine. The following list is a list of visitors who have lately been sojourning at the Tontine Hotel. Lord Compton, General Hunter, Colonel Page, Colonel La Balmondier and party, Captain Charteris, Royal Navy, Vice Admiral Sir Reginald MacDonald, Colonel Anderson, Ballachulish, Captain Stuart Monteith, Miss Vernon, Ballachulish, Mr. Forbes Irvine of Drum, Sheriff of Argyll, Mrs. Holdsworth, Mr. Nichol of Ardmarnock, Mr. and Mrs. Hazelhurst, Captain, and Mrs. Pryor of Oban. The MacDonald family, pictured here, were long associated with the Tontine. James MacDonald died at the Tontine on the 12th of December 1856. His eldest son, Alexander, died at 67 Finnert Street, Greenock on the 23rd of July 1885, aged 53. John, another son, died at Belleville in Canada in 1889, aged 50. An interesting advert here, lost on Sunday afternoon, supposed to be between the cotton and paper mills, a silver snuff box with Thomas Martin engraved on the lid of it. Whoever brings it to Mr. MacDonald at the Tontine will be handsomely rewarded. Greenock, the 16th of August 1847. Mrs. MacDonald was apparently quite a formidable lady. Here is a Telegraph report. A Christmas dinner was given yesterday, which we are sure was devoured with a keener relish than many of the great feasts of this festive season, as it is called. The children of the Ragged School, about 150 in number, were treated to a repast similar to what has been kindly provided to them at Christmas for several years past by a number of charitable ladies, and by the kind permission of Mrs. MacDonald, cooked in the Tontine Hotel. The attack upon the solids, which consisted of what are generally known as mince collops, had, we are told, something awful in it. The youthful guests returned again and again to the charge, and the collops vanished like anything, in short. They were afterwards regaled with what soiree bills called a service of tarts, filled with jam, which they swallowed with surprising vigour, not once exclaiming "Jam sati." We understand that out of the 150, only one gave in during dinner, crying "Hold, enough." After dinner, and to let digestion wait on appetite, the boys marched round the room singing various songs, and soon after the whole dispersed. The children were all remarkably clean and well dressed, the girls with brown pinafores, and a good many of the boys in coarse but clean canvas frocks. In fact, for the time, the name Ragged Schools was an instance of what scholars call lucus a non, etc. A number of ladies and gentlemen were present, who evidently took as much pleasure in beholding the dinner devoured as the youthful gourmand took in devouring it. Such an entertainment as this is highly creditable to the donors, and as it is surely one of those gifts which, as Shakespeare says, blesses him who gives and him who takes, we hope that each Christmas of succeeding years may be made as merry a one to these poor children as the present. The MacDonald family sold out to John Curry in 1873 after 50 years of ownership, and he in turn sold to a Mrs. McDermott in 1877. These are some of the notices that refer to Mr. Curry. A notice in the Telegraph states, "The Tontine Hotel, Greenock, has been let for a term of years to Mrs. McDermott, widow of Mr. McDermott of the McGregor Hotel calendar. The new tenant will, we understand, enter into possession on the 1st of September, and we are informed that Mr. Curry, the present lessee of the Tontine, has leased an hotel at Ballachulish." There was an interesting article in the Telegraph again mentioning Mrs. McDermott, and it's the following. "Today at the police court, Bailey Bremner on the bench, Martha Downey Douglas, a respectable looking young woman, was charged with having last night in the Tontine Hotel assaulted Mrs. McDermott, the landlady of the hotel. Accused pled not guilty. According to the evidence of Mrs. McDermott, it seemed that accused had been under housemaid in the hotel. From some cause or another she was dismissed yesterday morning. Last night accused was in the laundry of the hotel, and Mrs. McDermott, seeing her there, ordered her away. The young woman said she had come for a box and would not go away. The two got into grips, and Mrs. McDermott was struck on the head by accused with an umbrella, which the latter had in her hand. The force of the blow cut Mrs. McDermott's head. Before giving the blow, she said that she would smash Mrs. McDermott's face. William Stewart, boots in the hotel, deponed to being sent for by Mrs. McDermott to put accused out of the hotel. While doing so, he saw accused lift her umbrella and strike Mrs. McDermott on the head with it. Accused: "Willie, do you swear that I struck her?" Witness: "I do. I have sworn it." Accused: "Oh, thank you, Willie. I never expected that of a fellow servant. To think that you would tell a lie." A third witness stated that accused had come to the hotel to bid one of the servants goodbye. At the time she was found in the laundry by Mrs. McDermott. So far as she saw, accused never struck the mistress. The baillie said he was sorry to see such a respectable looking young woman at the bar of the court. It was perhaps true that she had gone to the hotel to bid goodbye to one of the servants, but she ought to have left when requested to do so. There was sufficient evidence to show that she had assaulted Mrs. McDermott, and the sentence of the court was that the accused be fined 10 shillings or 5 days' imprisonment. The Tontine, situated on Cathcart Street, was at the centre of the town and was considered a first-class establishment. Sir Donald Curry, born in Greenock, stood for Parliament in 1877. He addressed the Greenock crowd from the balcony of the Tontine. A close-up of said balcony. In 1880, the Tontine Society met to discuss closing up the Tontine. it was stated that only 20 shareholders were now existing whose names were in the original deed. So we presume that the formal Tontine ended in, say, 1881. The hotel was then sold to Mrs. Buchanan, the sister of Dr. Wallace. She had previously run the Temperance Hotel and then the White Hart before moving to the Tontine. It is here that we move to the second chapter of the Tontine story. As the government wanted to build a new general post office, and the site of the Tontine was chosen. The gentleman in the middle is James Wallace, who was a very influential figure in the history of Greenock. This obituary for his sister, Mrs. Buchanan, jumps ahead a bit in that it tells the story of how she became in charge of the Tontine in Cathcart Street and then in Argown Square. General regret will be felt at the death of Mrs. Buchanan of the Tontine Hotel, Argown Square, which took place about 10 o'clock on Saturday night after a week's illness. Mrs. Buchanan, who was the widow of Mr. James Buchanan, ship store merchant, Greenock, and a sister of the late Dr. James Wallace, had been connected with the hotel business in town for close on 50 years. On the death of her husband, she became associated with Mann's Temperance Hotel in Cathcart Square, which stood near what is now the carriage entrance to the town hall. She afterwards occupied the White Hart Hotel on the opposite side of the square, which is now the Clydesdale Bank buildings, and subsequently the old Tontine Hotel in Cathcart Street on the retiral of Mrs. McDermott. Mrs. Buchanan remained in this hotel until it was bought by the government, who demolished the building and erected a general post office on the site, which was opened in May 1899. Prior to this, Mrs. Buchanan purchased the late Matthew Brown's property at 5 Argown Square, Union Street, which she fitted up as a first-class hotel. She was much esteemed by the public of Greenock and by the numerous visitors who made her hotel their temporary home, especially during the tourist season. During the Great Stress in 1878 and 1879, when the Masonic Brethren, headed by Lodge Greenock St John No. 175, established soup kitchens in town, Mrs. Buchanan gave the movement her heartiest support, and by her personal assistance did much to further the successful working of arrangements. In recognition of her services, she was presented by the Masonic Brethren with a handsome marble clock. She was the second oldest member of the East Parish Church. Mrs. Buchanan retired from active duty 2 years ago when the licence was transferred to her daughter, who has been long associated in the management of the Tontine. And so we see two images of what was built in place of the Tontine. The General Post Office, or as it is now known, Witherspoons. And so we turn to the site of the new Tontine in Argown Square. It was the home of George Robertson, originally from Bute, who came to Greenock as a clerk and became one of the most influential men in the history of the town. One of the merchant princes, he was involved in so many businesses and ventures. He part-owned a sugar refinery, he was in business with Robert Wallace and James Hunter, trading all over the world in fish, timber and many other products. He was a partner in a bank, owner of a privateer which fought against the French and Americans, and he set up the Shaw's Water Company and was a government contractor for supplying the Navy. He also married his daughters to some of the most influential men of the time, including Sir Neil Douglas, who fought at Waterloo and whose family were West Indian plantation owners. Another daughter married James Eccles, another West Indian merchant. At the time, his mansion in Argown Square was out in the countryside, as you can see from this map. In this map of 1857, you'll see that Robertson Street hasn't been formed yet, and the gardens of the old mansion extend to the north and west of the building. Horticulture was one of the main hobbies of the rich at that time. They employed gardeners to vie with other house owners or other merchants in the town, and it was important to be seen to own some of the best gardens in the area. This is a newspaper report stating that there is now in flower in the garden of George Robertson Esquire of Argown Square a splendid specimen of the Crinum amabila, a native plant of the East Indies. The fact that this made the news and was in newspapers at the time shows the importance of this pastime. This article gives an interesting description of George Robertson's garden, in that he had a vinery or glasshouses measuring 48 by 15 feet. It states, "A vine of the black Gibraltar kind is now in full bearing in the garden of George Robertson Esquire near Greenock, which can only be paralleled in this island by the celebrated one at Hampton Court, and in point of productiveness appears this year to have exceeded it. It is 18 years old, occupies a house 48 by 15 feet, and for the last 10 years has produced annually from 800 to 1500 bunches of grapes. For this season it has the astonishing number of 1920 bunches, averaging 11 pounds weight each, while that at Hampton Court, it is believed, never produced more than 1500. The vine is planted in the front border and brought into the house at the centre, from which it is trained both ways." So we have heard about the General Post Office, and now the situation being that Mrs. Buchanan was looking for a new location for her business. Fortunately, a mansion in the west end of Greenock came up for sale. So as we've said, it's George Robertson's mansion, and we'll now continue the story of the Tontine in Argown Square. In consequence of the government having acquired the Tontine hotel site in Cathcart Street for the erection of a new post office in Greenock, Mrs. Buchanan, whose lease of the hotel expires on Whitsunday next, has opened negotiations with the representatives of the late Mr. Matthew Brown, with the view of becoming tenant of the large and handsome building at 5 Argown Square, near the foot of Robertson Street, and converting it into a first-class hotel, should their application for a licence for the same be granted in the court to be held on Tuesday week. It is understood that Mrs. Buchanan has been further induced to select the site by the knowledge that the Glasgow and South Western Railway Company do not intend building an hotel in association with their new station at Prince's Pier. Due regard has also been given to the fact that the opening of an hotel here, overlooking as it would do a splendid portion of the scenery of the Clyde, would likely prove of great convenience and afford excellent facilities to tourists and others making Prince's Pier their point of departure for the coast and the West Highlands. The matter has also some interest for the Police Board. In November of last year, the Streets Committee had under consideration the opening of Robertson Street from Argown Square northwards to Brougham Street, but the negotiations with Brown's trustees on the subject fell through. If the licence is granted, it is just possible that the proprietors may open up the street to Brougham Street and have the ground feud, which would prove a benefit both to the public and the proprietors. It may be of interest to point out that the handsome pile of buildings forming 5 Argown Square was erected almost 80 years ago by Baillie George Robertson of the firm of Robertson, Hunter and Co. and Wallace, Hunter and Co., who were ship owners and merchant princes in Greenock, and held letters of marque in the olden times, in addition to being government contractors in a large way, especially in the furnishing of supplies for the Navy. His father, it is understood, was factor to the Marquess of Bute. Young George came to Greenock as a clerk, and by his energy and perseverance succeeded in making the business with which he was connected one of the most important in the kingdom, and by means of which he amassed a large fortune. He was a man of considerable note in town, and was the originator of the Shawswater Company. Shortly before the house was erected, Greenock estate was in the market, and it is said that he considered whether he should purchase this estate or build the house. He decided on the latter course. He would have nothing to do with a contract job, and the construction of the house occupied about 2 years, during which the men were paid day's wages and were also, it is said, supplied with 3 glasses of rum each day. The house then had a large portion of ground attached to it, extending from High to Low Greenock Road, and stretching for some distance both in an easterly and westerly direction. After Mr. Robertson passed away, some of his sons cared to maintain the mansion in the grand style of their father, and the house fell into other hands. The lands have been greatly curtailed in recent years, but the house was still a large amount of ground attached to it. The last occupants were Mr. Matthew Brown, sugar refiner, and his 2 sisters. Since their death, the house has been in the market. This is a rather blurry drawing of the mansion, and this is a picture, a relatively recent picture in all its Georgian splendour. Mr. Robertson died in the house in the square on the 7th of March 1828 in the 73rd year of his age, and was buried in Inverkip Street graveyard. One of his businesses was with the Whitby whaler William Scoresby. They used the ship called the John, and one of its harpoons is currently on view in the Maclean Museum. On the left is Mr. Robertson's gravestone, and on the right is Mr. Scoresby. This is an early representation of Greenock by the artist Robert Salmon, which shows Robertson's mansion among the fields of the Finnart estate. Behind are the masses of ship masts in Greenock's harbours, the bottle works with smoke belching out, and further east towards Port Glasgow in the distance. So as I say, Robertson's mansion is in the middle. You can see the 2 end buildings, and in the foreground is Glen Cottage and Balclutha as we know it now, or Finnart House. His sons George and John carried on the business. John went on to build Bagatelle, and the original mansion was then let out to tenants. The sons of Robertson appear to have had some financial woes at the time, but they did move to Liverpool, where the family set up businesses and were quite successful there in the cotton trade. This map shows Robertson Street formed, but with no other buildings around the mansion. Patrick McFarlane, a leading light in the Free Church and minister at the New West Church, lived in the mansion for a while in the 1830s. He had been responsible for building the West Kirk on Nelson Street in 1841, but left soon after at the disruption in 1843. This photograph is one of the earliest photos taken in Scotland in 1843 by Adamson and Hill. The next owner was Adam Ferry, who went to Liverpool in 1847 and constructed a refinery in Vauxhall Road and worked it under the name of J, T and A Ferry until 1866, when the firm became Ferry and Company. He married Margaret Johnson and had 11 children. He died in 1879, aged 81. Adam and Thomas were active members of the Royal West Renfrewshire Horticultural Society in the 1840s. Adam continued this interest in Liverpool. While in Greenock, he served on the council and was provost, starting the work at Victoria Harbour. He was heavily involved with the establishment of the infirmary and lived at what is now the Tontine building. On this map on your right, you can see the Tontine, I call it Tontine, the Robertson mansion, but now with the name of Mr. Adam Ferry as the owner. And on the left is the sales details. To be sold by private bargain or let to a respectable tenant, that commodious dwelling house in Argown Square, lately occupied by Mr. Adam Ferry. This house is suitable for the accommodation of a large family and has every convenience that can be desired. The offices are extensive and the garden large and well stocked. The situation is excellent and within a quarter of an hour's walk of the railway station. After Adam Ferry, the mansion belonged to Mr. Brown with his sisters and was seen as the most palatial in town, and from it there proceeded more social and political influence than from any habitation. Mr. Ferry had a large family and, although ostentatious, exercised a powerful moral force in conjunction with his brother Thomas for the good of the community. As sugar refiner here, he was the most enterprising of our manufacturers, being a partner in 2 houses, one in the Glebe and one at Cartstike. And as an employer, he was greatly esteemed for his consideration and kindness, but the latter characteristic was an heirloom belonging to the family, which the deceased gentleman exercised with a cheerfulness that was as second nature to him. Although the younger generation of Greenock cannot remember Adam Ferry's manly figure, all our townsmen who have been resident in Greenock for the last 30 or 40 years will feel that in his death a man has passed away to whom Greenock owes more than any son she has ever reared. This is Matthew Brown, another refiner who, as I said, stayed there with his 2 sisters. The late Mr. Matthew Brown. By the death of the above gentleman on Saturday afternoon, Greenock has lost one of its oldest and most respected citizens. He resided in that fine mansion in Union Street, built by Baillie Robertson, and in succession occupied by some of our best known townsmen. Mr. Brown first connected himself with our industries by engaging in Messrs. Ferry's sugar refining works as a bookkeeper. He afterwards joined Mr. James Richardson in Greenock and Port Glasgow as a sugar refiner under the firm of Matthew Brown & Co., which he maintained for many years. At the period of his death he had long retired from business and during several years was an invalid. He was never married, but a maiden sister survives him. Mr. Brown had reached the age of 77, and although not associated in local politics, he was known as a courteous and generous man, whether in business roles or in regard to religious and social affairs. A member of the established church, he gave liberally of his means to advance its interests, and as a lover of nature, he was well known in circles where field sports are held in estimation. There are many in Greenock who will deplore his death, and none who have caused to speak of his life disrespectfully. And I presume his early relationship with Ferry allowed him the position to move into the house or the mansion of Robertsons. And so after his death, there was a sale of the house on the 28th of December 1892. The mansion house and grounds of number 5 Ergown Square, having a frontage to Union Street of about 125 feet and extending back from that street about the same distance. Few duty of £10, entry immediately, at an upset price of £1,500. Another piece on the Robertson Mansion goes as follows. Built in 1808 by Mr. George Robertson, as a private house, the Tontine Hotel stands on the site of the first windmill in the district to be used for grinding corn. At this time it was also the most westerly house in the district. Mr. Robertson, well known in connection with the Shaw's water scheme, was also reputed to have been the owner of the first private carriage in the town, as well as being the first to own a piano. He also appeared to have taken care of his workers, as the men who built the house, apart from being paid a day's wages, were said to have been supplied with 3 glasses of rum each day. The house remained as a private home until 1892, when Mrs. Buchanan, then proprietor of the Tontine Hotel in Cathcart Street, became the tenant and converted the mansion into an hotel. The Service family took over the hotel in 1907 and continued to run it till 1955. In 1958 the hotel was bought by Lithgow's Limited. This newspaper article is interesting. Some years ago, attention was directed in this column to the initials JHR 1815, carved close to the right-hand bottom corner of the window of the Tontine Hotel in Argown Square, nearest Robertson Street. They were those of James Hunter Robertson, a son of George Robertson, senior magistrate of Greenock, who built the mansion in 1808. James H. became a doctor in the middle life and settled at Bootle. He published various works of hygienic importance and was appointed medical officer of the Mersey Dock Board. Noticing that his initials and the date which had withstood the ravages of time and weather for 125 years had become almost indecipherable, I took the liberty of mentioning the matter to Mrs. Service of the hotel, and I am pleased to say that she promptly agreed to have the original inscription deepened so as to further preserve it. Here we have a nice aerial view of Argown Square, surrounding area, and the Tontine Hotel. Here we see pictures of the hotel. This is during the First World War, or just before it, showing it being used as the base for the Renfrewshire fox hunt. An advert for the Tontine Hotel from Mrs. Buchanan, the proprietrix. A first-class hotel, pleasantly and quietly situated near Prince's Pier and Station. Tramcars pass foot of Robertson Street every 20 minutes to and from town. As we mentioned, Walter and John Service once owned the Tontine. They owned the Deer Park Flour Mill on Baker Street. With the purchase of the Tontine Hotel by Messrs. John Service and Sons, bakers and purveyors, the family of Buchanan became dissociated with the fortunes of this well-known hostelry. For over 50 years, the name of Buchanan has been prominently identified in this line of business. On the death of her husband, who was a ship store merchant in the town, Mrs. Buchanan became connected with the Man's Temperance Hotel in Cathcart Square, which stood near what is now the carriage entrance to the town hall. We've read this before, but since her death in October of last year, the hotel has been under the management of Miss Buchanan, from whom it has just been purchased by Messrs. John Service and Sons. The Tontine has always been seen as a classy place to have events and wedding receptions, as well as funeral parties. This photo shows a wedding party in the grounds, and is possibly the wedding of the sister of a local lawyer, Peter McBrain, who fought with the 5th Argylls at Gallipoli on the Western Front. He is on the right hand of the picture. So again, the Tontine fulfilling the same purpose as the Tontine Hotel in Cathcart Square, as a place to go, place to meet with friends, business associates and colleagues from various sporting backgrounds, etc. In the Second World War, the hotel was taken over as accommodation for the Wrens. It was also used as a bar and a meeting place for a variety of local military and navy officers. And this is a newspaper report that I found that showed the title "Old Battle Axes Due to Muster for a Reunion." Members of the 78th Infantry Division's Battle Axe Club are invited to a special 50th anniversary reunion dinner to mark the unit's landing in North Africa in 1942. The division was formed in the Stirling area from various UK regiments and units, including the 8th Battalion Argyll and Southern Highlanders, the 14th Anti-Tank Regiment and Fife and Angus units of the Royal Volunteers. When the unit landed in Algeria, it forced the German army to withdraw its eastern forces facing the British 8th Army in Libya to defend their western front. The division then went on to become one of Britain's most successful fighting units in Sicily and Italy. Battle Axe Club was formed in 1945 and successful annual reunions have been held since. This year's will be on October the 3rd at the Tontine Hotel Greenock, which is fitting as it was in Greenock that the division's convoy gathered before setting off to Africa. In 1958, the shipbuilding company Lithgows bought the hotel from the services in order to provide a place where they could put up and entertain their business associates. This article is taken from the Lithgow magazine and gives a brief history as well as some interesting images of the hotel as it was in 1958. Another image of the hotel, and this is a picture of manager Dave McCulloch of the Tontine Hotel taking special care as he winds up this rather unique looking clock from another era. It was constructed by a James Gardner or Gardner in Greenock and was discovered in a cupboard in the hotel by Dave sometime after he took over. It wasn't working, so I had it taken to Glasgow for repairs and discovered that it was worth between £400 and £500, he said. One problem is that the clock has a very loud chime, and the one way to keep it silent is not to wind it. Again, a nice postcard view of Union Street with the Tontine on your left. Another advert for the hotel. A letterhead from the hotel in later days, 70s I would imagine. And finally, the newspaper article saying that the management team had bought out the Lithgow's Hotel Group. The team was led by the former managing director of Scott Lithgow, Mr. Ross Belch. I'll stop there with this lovely photograph of the stairway where generations of Greenockians have had their photos taken at the bottom of. You know the latest story or the up-to-date story of the hotel, so I won't go into that. I'll leave that to the current proprietors of the hotel to tell their story on their website. Thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed it.